Back with you on the Newsfeed PM. Thanks for staying on. Let's continue now with some analysis on Rasool's return. We are joined by international relations expert Brooks Spector. Brooks, good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on. Coming back with no regrets is what we are hearing from the expelled ambassador, persona non grata now. He says it was meant to really humiliate him, but the welcome has made him feel otherwise. Is the United States really still watching the outcome of this particular action by the Trump administration and how he's been received in the country, things that he is saying on his reception and so on and so forth? Are these things that are going to come back to bite South Africa?
Well, I'm sure that some people are watching. Obviously, if nothing else, the embassy, which I obviously am not part of, the embassy will have paid attention to this, and they will be obligated to report back to Washington on what happened and what was said and by whom. But I think realistically, the focus has to be turned toward the future. I mean, Ebrahim Rasool gave vent to a lot of feelings, justifications about what he said and why. But he also made the important point, and I think you need to focus on that the U.S.-South Africa relationship, or the South Africa-U.S. relationship, depending on which side of the table you're on, is important, and the rifts and the divisions, that there must be efforts to make those rifts narrower, smaller, and make the cooperative side of things better.
Yeah.
And there is a sort of an interesting moment here. Neither country has an ambassador in the other country right now. Yeah. The Americans haven't appointed somebody to come to South Africa, and now the South Africans are going to have to appoint a new person to be the nominee to go to the United States. And if there is a positive in this, it's that there is an opportunity to find two people who can be the adults in the room, shall we say.
So BRICS is our partner, and we should not compromise on that, according to Ebrahim Rasool. China is our partner. We should not compromise on that. Equally, the relationships that we have with the United States should be pursued. Can we have both? Can you have your cake and eat it, so to speak?
Well, I mean, all countries try to have relations, and hopefully good ones, with neighboring states, with large, powerful states, and with states with which they have large and continuing economic relations. And let's make no mistake about it: the United States is one of South Africa's most important trading partners. There are 600 or more American companies that have operations and investments in South Africa. And importantly, too, remember, the United States is one of the few places on the planet where South Africa has a trade surplus in its economic relations. And that's not a function of government behavior as much as it is the actions of individual or corporate exporters of goods and services to the United States. And unlike the trade relations, say, with China, you export to America. There are finished motor vehicles, there are automobile parts, there are highly processed agricultural products, which is a synonym for fine quality wines and other such things. By contrast, what's exported to China is almost entirely ships with rocks in them, because they're going to be processed elsewhere. That's not to minimize the impact of it, but to say that you're getting more value added for money to the extent that products are exported to the U.S. And there's also all that personal relationship, cultural productions and cultural products and books, and individual artists and performers routinely go back and forth. Who was that young woman who just won a Grammy in the United States recently from South? There you go.
Yeah.
You won't see that happen too much with most other countries, but you do see it with South Africa and the United States. And all these things are more than simply the government-to-government relationship. That's not to say the government-to-government relationship's not important, but the American-South African connection is much broader than just the two governments either talking nicely to each other or squabbling.
According to his own scorecard, right, as he marks himself, he says, well, did I manage to deal with the misinformation around white genocide in South Africa? No, I didn't manage to convince them. He says, did I manage to secure a AGOA? No, I did not manage to do that. Did I manage to convince them that our position at the ICJ is the correct one, as much as the rest of the globe has now taken that position and supporting us? Says, no, I did not. Did I get more trade deals? No, I did not. So, according to him, conventional diplomacy did not work. But equally so, he says, we shouldn't capitulate and send a white ambassador to represent a black president. Could any ambassador sent there, a white one in particular, as he puts it, be able to score a little bit better on those 4 areas?
Well, I mean, to the extent that he enumerates, that Rasool enumerated a list of things that he was not successful at, what that says is, it says a number of things. It could say that he was not good at it. It could say that the climate in Washington was not receptive to him. It could say he misread the room in Washington as well, that he failed to understand the new administration and the political landscape and didn't connect effectively that way. Remember, I mean, previously he'd been ambassador to the U.S. and by most reports had performed fairly credibly and without controversy for the most part. But a diplomat, especially an ambassador, should be judged on their success at either improving or keeping stable a relationship, or at the very worst, not allowing things to slip further and further away from a decent and stable relationship. As to whether or not who South Africa should appoint, or the president, obviously, should appoint as your next ambassador to the United States, I don't think it's my place to say who, to list names, but I would offer a couple of attributes which I think would be useful in judging. And one of those would be someone who has success domestically in something other than South African politics. I would add somebody who has significant experience, both either internationally in some extended way or significant international connections, and somebody who understands the realities of the American political landscape as it is now, prickly and difficult that might be. Now, are there people in the country now who could do that? I think there are. I think there are a number of such people, but the president's going to have to pick carefully and thoughtfully to figure out who can best make all those points possible.
Yeah. Can they be able to do that without flattery? It's just doing what he says. He says diplomacy is about speaking truth gently. It's not about lying to the host country. It's not about flattery to the host country. It's not about, I suppose, being undignified either, but also keeping our dignity as a country. It spells a new era, I suppose, in what diplomacy would certainly look like. How would you be still able to speak truth to power in this particular instance, gently, as we put it? It's going to be a very difficult undertaking.
Well, I mean, being a diplomat does not mean that you have to flatter and fawn and behave as if you were a 15th century courtier in the court of Louis XIV. Not actually 17th century, if you were in the court of Louis XIV. But it does mean being able to speak skillfully and adroitly to the power structures that exist in the country you're assigned to, without making them angry at you such that they lock you out of the discussion. I mean, I've seen ambassadors in many different countries, both American and other countries, and some of them have been in the position of speaking truthfully about sensitive or complex issues, but they've done it in a way which doesn't make the host country feel like they've just been given a lecture by the teacher and they've been a recalcitrant 10th grade student. I'll give you one example. from my own experience, Mike Mansfield, who had been a senator in the United States for decades and was appointed ambassador to Japan, no American president, while Mansfield was ambassador, was prepared to relieve him. He served for almost 11 years through, I think it was 4 different presidential administrations. The Japanese felt honored by his presence, but they listened carefully to his critique and his criticism of, among other things, the Japanese defense posture or its positions on international trade and non-tariff barriers to American exports to Japan. It requires somebody who has dexterity and skill without necessarily looking like you're fawning and, falling over yourself to flatter. And it's a complex task.
Indeed, that complexity has been in existence, according to the expelled ambassador, for 50 years, saying it's a complexity South Africa-US relations have been navigating for 50 years. But he also then says it's a complex and nuanced relationship with the United States. We must fight for that relationship. How does the United States feel about that? Do they feel they want to fight for that relationship, or is the United States at this particular point quite nonchalant about it?
Well, and I can't speak for all 360 million Americans, obviously, but I think it is important to note that the relationship between the two countries is seen more keenly and more closely and more directly by South Africans than it is by the United States for the most part. I mean, there was a period in the 1980s and early 90s where the U.S.-South African connection was front page news in both good and bad ways, obviously. But it's receded in part because, at least in Washington and official circles, there are lots of other things that are now more pressing, more important, and more salient to America's success or circumstances. Can I just add a note on a personal basis? There were 3 South African ambassadors that I interacted with in one way or another, who I thought did a really good job of finding the path and the thread for the connection. One was right at the tail end of the apartheid regime. The South Africans appointed the banker Harry Swartz to be ambassador, and it was a recognition that obviously the apartheid era that chapter was going to close very quickly. And Swartz had come from what was then the Progressive Federal Party, I think it was called at that point, but represented the country and gained the respect of people in Washington because he seemed to tell the hard truths about what was going to happen. Franklin Sonn, who followed him in the new era, managed to make connections that were beyond simply the old anti-apartheid circles in Washington. And the third person, somebody I happen to personally like, but there we are, is Barbara Masekela, who had spent over a decade in the U.S. teaching and studying, and then was appointed to be your ambassador there in the early 2000s, I believe it was. And she was able to connect quickly to intellectual and cultural and political circles by virtue of knowing the way the country was put together. And, you can't ignore that kind of knowledge as being important for an ambassador who goes to a country, especially if the dynamic in the relationship is not absolutely equal. The U.S. is more important to South Africa, and I'm being very honest now, than South Africa is to the United States under current circumstances. And whoever you pick must reflect that ability to say, look, we are important for our sake, and you are very important for us as well, even though we have disagreements over some of the things that Ebrahim Rasool actually enumerated in his remarks.
Yeah.
Not the least of course, was the ICJ case.
Brooks, appreciate your time. Thank you for your intervention this afternoon. International relations expert, Brooks Spector.